Today, we're focusing on governance. We'll start with opening with Dr. Robert Andringa. He will open our day with a keynote address on universal principles of good governance. He will discuss proven principles of governance that can guide any organization wanting to improve, wanting to go from good to great. This presentation will focus on key governance principles and how different organizations apply them. He'll do a follow-up workshop that will explore what modifications could make these principles work for our courts. He has spent 40 years serving in government, higher education, and the broader nonprofit sector. He served as a committee staff director in the U.S. House of Representatives, senior policy director for a governor to build a cabinet and strategic plan, CEO of 2 national nonprofits, chair of several boards, authors of 2 books, and many articles on the topic. He holds a BA, MA, and PhD from Michigan State University and holds 4 honorary degrees, among other accomplishments. I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Dr. Andringa to open up our session.
Good morning. I had fun just thinking, sitting here, my first exposure to governance. After grad school and the Army, I took a job in Washington, D.C. and worked under a governing board. It was dysfunctional. Peter Drucker says, there's one thing in common about governing boards. They don't function well. Well, this was the House of Representatives, and it didn't function very well back then, and it may not function much better. In fact, I would think it's gone the other direction today. So that was the legislative branch experience in governance, and it goes down through the states and the cities. Then I went on a moment's notice almost to Minnesota to help a good friend of mine, a congressman, run for governor, and he did win, and all of a sudden I'm in the executive branch looking at governance issues. The governor had a cabinet of 33 people, and that could be called a board. And many of those commissioners and directors also had commissions, consuls that functioned much like a board. So it's a delight for me to really have my first in-depth exposure to the judiciary and to learn that you too are struggling with issues of governance. So in this hour together, we're going to look at 15 principles that I think would fit the executive branch, the legislative branch, and hopefully the judicial branch. You're going to be the judges of that. And in this hour together, I'm going to ask you in pairs of 2s or 3s, if it's more convenient, to share quickly your reactions to some of these principles. So you've had your coffee. Would you make sure that you know who's next to you or with you, where you're from, and make sure you probably came together and are sitting with friends already, but take a minute to greet one another if you haven't met. Okay. You're having far too much fun. Let's get back to work. On your tables should be copies of this PowerPoint presentation. So my job is to simply amplify on those things that are already there. First, some context. When I was called about doing this session, I said, but I don't know much about the courts. And one of the staff of NACM said, that's perfect. I said, it is? He said, we want you to talk about governance from your experience and not try too hard to apply it to the courts. Well, I did read some articles and some wonderful reports by NACM, and I did appreciate that you, like most of the nonprofit world, which is where I spend most of my time, are struggling with some of the same issues. Our funders are broke, so we're dealing with lack of resources. Technology seems to be changing everything. Some of our constituencies are losing confidence in us, and we have to get governance down well to handle these issues. So the world that I'm going to talk about is really what many would call the nonprofit sector. In the world, there are an estimated 6 to 7 million NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Some countries call them PVOs, private volunteer organizations. In America, we tend to say the nonprofit sector. And there are about 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the U.S. Most of them come under the IRS code called 501c3s, but there are 501c4s, 5s, 6, 7, and 8. There may be 20 different classifications. Most of them that you're familiar with are probably charities or 501c3s. So that's the area that I'm most familiar with. And they function under articles of incorporation given by states. So state statutes guide the work of the nonprofit sector. But they also obviously have to comply with IRS regulations, other health and safety regulations, and everything that others have as well. One thing is common about all of these, and that is they have boards of directors. Now, the House of Representatives never called itself a board of directors, but it functioned like one. The governor's cabinet didn't ever call itself a board. I don't think we even used the word governance, but it did function like one. So in this broad sector, there are small boards of 3. One of the best boards I served on was 3. But I also worked for a board of 55. A third of them were governors, a third of them were legislators, and a third of them were state education officials. Governor Bob Graham was my first chairman, governor of Florida. And then it flipped. The Democrat, Republican. I lasted for only 5 years in that environment. It was a very political environment. So you have small boards, you have large boards. The average board is 16 in America. NACM's board is 15 or 16, so you're about average. There are boards who get most of their funding from the federal government, flowing down from the federal government through state government, sometimes to counties, and then to service delivery organizations. Some boards are entirely dependent on donors. Almost all of their income comes from donors, foundations, private individuals. Some of these organizations provide services, conferences, they get registration fees, they sell publications. They try to exist on service fees. And many nonprofits have a variety of revenue sources. So it's very hard to be descriptive of the nonprofit sector with too many generalizations. One thing that is common is that all boards do have a chair. It sounds like in NACM the chair is called the president. So they go by different titles. It could be a chief judge. But that's getting into your world, and I'm supposed to stay out of that. That will come later. But chairs are sometimes appointed. The University of Virginia just went through an interesting thing where the chair, appointed by the governor and others, got in trouble by firing a president. 2 weeks later, rehired her. Any group needs a leader, and in the nonprofit world we say that's the board chair, by whatever title. Some of them are very skilled at being chair, and others are not so skilled. And I'll get to that a little later. They also have a chief staff officer. In the nonprofit world, sometimes they're called executive directors, or presidents, or secretary generals in other countries. They go by various titles, but it needs to be clear who is the chief executive officer. So we shorten that by saying the CEO. Who's your board chair? Who's your CEO? Doesn't matter what the title is. Those are the generic terms used most widely. What is common, as Drucker suggested, there's no perfect board. I've worked with close to 500 of them, and there's no perfect board. If I were to distill best practices for governing boards, there would easily be 100 best practices. So the best boards may do really well on 70 or 80, okay on 8 or 10, and another 8 or 10 they haven't even addressed. Like, how does technology impact governance? That's just a new topic, with board portals and conference calls and websites and webinars for board members and so on. A lot of boards haven't even gotten there yet. Well, imagine for this time together that you are on a nonprofit board of directors. How many of you are or have been on at least one nonprofit board of directors? Would you raise your hand? It looks to me, and I could be off, like 39% of you, give or take. So you have some experience. Now, you may think of one of those that you've served on during this time, or you may think about an imagined one. Maybe you'd like to be on the school board, or maybe you would like to be on the board of a homeless shelter, whatever. Think of one and imagine yourself on that board. It's going to help you as we go through these principles. So here we are in a room for training on good governance. We're all members of a board of directors. Some are brand new to this topic, so we're going to have an orientation on what to anticipate you doing that would contribute to the quality of governance of your nonprofit. We'll learn 15 principles today. I did a similar presentation a few months ago to chairmen of national organizations from 40 nations. I had no idea language differences, cultural differences. Maybe half of these principles today I used with them, another half seemed to fit more their situation. But those work for us. So that was very helpful to know, and I'm hopeful that today these 15 principles will work for you. But all of you get to be the judge on whether that's the case. And so I know that while you're imagining working on this nonprofit board, you're also thinking, which is good, about your day job. And you're going to be making some translations and transfers of these principles to your situation. I don't know what you're thinking, but I'm going to invite you after the first 5 principles to turn to that person that you met and share your ratings of these principles. And I invite you to rate each principle 1 to 5. 1 means no way. I can't even imagine that applying in our court. A 5 would mean that's a very helpful principle. That should be on our checklist. Whatever we do about governance, that principle should work its way through. So as we go through, on your own handout, just mark 1 to 5, and then I'll invite you to share that for a couple minutes with those near you. I would love to see your ratings, but I will learn as much as I can later. Okay? The first thing I was oblivious to for several years of working with boards. I thought if there are good board principles, just do it. But it doesn't work that way, does it? There's a culture in every organization, and we have to understand the culture because often the culture trumps any new idea. No matter how relevant it might be, the culture trumps. So every board has a culture. Usually it's a reflection of the culture of the larger organization, but sometimes it has its own culture because of personalities. A personality has been chair of that board for several years, and the culture is a reflection of that personality. Most people resist change, so when that chair leaves, if it's a personality-driven culture, then the new chair has a struggle to change the culture. But change is the new constant. Everything we read, everything we see, we're just saying we're not going back. There's not even a new normal. There is no normal. Today's normal will be yesterday's. So we need to move ahead. To even stay competitive in most nonprofits, you have to change. You may be very good today, but so was the RCA Corporation years ago, or any number of corporations that Jim Collins' books would say were excellent organizations 20 years ago. Many of them aren't even here today. So we have to keep changing or we lose. Now, hopefully, in any board, there would be 1 or 2 people who are just gifted with process that builds trust and confidence, with asking good questions that brings the group back to focus. And so ideally, you'll find on many boards, the leaders are not necessarily the chairs. They are the ones who ask the right questions, who find a way to reconcile major differences, and who have wisdom enough to suggest what might work now. So governance which I'm going to define for you in a minute. It's not on one of the slides, and there are as many definitions as there are people working with governance. But everyone needs to be brought along. You can't have an idea about how things should go unless everyone shares in that idea. And on a governing board, you need to have not unanimous opinions all the time, but you need to have unity around the way you're going to do things. And that takes skilled communications. Let me try this out on you. You can write it down on the back of your handout if you would like, but here would be a very simple, generic definition of governance. Governance is the structure and the process by which a defined group of people are accountable to various constituencies to exercise authority over an organization. Hopefully that'll work for you. Governance is the structure and the process by which a defined group of people, the board, or whatever name you give to that group, are accountable to various constituencies, maybe members of an NACM. They're accountable to you to exercise authority. Some would say control. They have ultimate authority so long as they're within the law. They can do whatever they do, and we'll talk about some who do more than they should do and some who do less than they should do. Okay? So we want to honor the culture, but the culture has to be open to new ideas. Some cultures are very evidence-driven, like the Missouri folks here, the show me state. Prove it. Other cultures seem to be influenced by the driving personalities. I've worked with boards where no one says anything bad about anybody. Very cordial. And then I will go with a board that it seems like everybody is saying everything bad about the others, accusing the others of not being ready to change, not seeing the facts, not having the mission in mind, having a personal agenda, whatever it is, and everything in between. So the first principle is to honor the culture you're in. You can rate that 1 to 5. The second principle is to clarify roles for everyone. Now, you know what you do, but the person down the hall may not know what you do. All the time, the issue is to clarify. And I think everyone, whether paid or volunteer in a nonprofit organization, has 5 questions. First, what am I expected to do? Job descriptions don't cut it. Once you're hired or appointed or elected, you want to know, what am I expected to do? The second question everyone has is, why is that important? I remember walking through a large organization one day, just meeting the staff, seeing the facility, and I came to a data entry operator, and I said, well, what are you doing? And she says, well, I take this stack of spreadsheets, and there's 5 columns here, and I enter onto another spreadsheet. And I said, well, why are you doing that? She said, darned if I know. I think it's the stupidest thing I could imagine. Well, that's a happy employee, right? She had no clue why she was asked to do what she was doing. The third question is, when I need help, not if, when I need help, where can I go? So a court administrator says, can I hire a consultant? Can I engage an outside law firm? Can I create an advisory group? Where can I go without offending someone? The fourth question is, are my ideas considered? Everyone has ideas. In fact, improving many organizations, simply going around and asking people who already work there, what are your ideas to improve what we're doing? And many times, leaders of organizations ignore the need that people have to know that their ideas are at least being heard. And the fifth question is, how am I doing so far? Now, in one of the organizations that I had the privilege of serving, my assistant, Denise, she needed this information every day. If I went 3 or 4 days, she would come in, and back then I was dictating letters. She would say, "Are you mad at me?" "Denise, no, I'm not mad at you." She says, "Well, you haven't said anything about my work for quite a while." Now, next to her was my CFO. Once a year, performance reviews, that's all I need. Different personalities. So as managers and leaders, we need to appreciate that some around us need the answer to this question more often than others. So in the nonprofit world, we need to write out what are the expectations of every board member. New board members come on. I remember in the House of Representatives, freshmen would say to me, "You know, I've been sitting on the House floor for 5 months now. I haven't said anything. I'm trying to figure out what it is we do here. When should I talk? When should I not talk?" And we can improve on that. We can define what the expectations are of people sitting on the governance board. Next, we need to define what is the authority and the role of the chair. The chair is the leader of the board. Any group needs a leader, so the chair is the leader of the group. But I want to give you a couple exceptions. The governor that I worked for was a born legislator. He loved to horse trade. He needed a group. He needed to process. As governor, everyone says, "Governor, what do you want to do?" So he chaired a few of these cabinet meetings of 33, I think it was, state department heads. And he said, "I hate chairing that meeting." He said, "I can't watch body language. I'm watching the clock. I'm trying to think of how to cut someone off. I'm thinking we won't get the agenda." He says, "I hate it." I said, "Governor, you're still the governor, but you don't have to chair that meeting." "Oh, I don't?" I said, "No, we have a lieutenant governor. We don't know what to do with him." And he was a school superintendent, so he went to board meetings all the time. Ask him to chair the meeting. It worked perfectly. I was on the board of elders of a Presbyterian church, and our pastor came out of kind of a warm, fuzzy, hugging everybody. "What's your story? How you been doing?" We'd never get to the agenda. So I said to the pastor one day, I said, "You know, you're not a gifted board chair. Do you know that?" And he said, "But the manual says I'm the moderator. I have to chair the board." I said, "Well, you're the moderator, so what? You don't have to facilitate the meeting." "I don't?" "No. You're the boss. Ask someone else to chair the meeting. You don't give up your authority. You're just using someone gifted at that role." What's the authority and role of the chief executive? Huge tension over board versus staff. The board shouldn't decide that, the staff would say. And on the next topic, the board would say the staff shouldn't decide that topic. So we need to clarify those roles, and we'll talk more about to do that. Who's on the board? With or without vote. Sometimes there's ex officio, by virtue of position, people that sit on the board. And sometimes it's not clear whether they should sit off to the side or whether they should sit at the board table. It's not clear whether, if at the board table, they can raise their hand and say something, or whether they're just there to be called upon. So we need to just clarify that. It can work either way, but let's be clear, so we don't inadvertently offend one another. Well, what authority does the board have? Some boards are actually state manifestations of a national organization. And the national organization sets some of the rules. And so the state organization has to honor those rules and says, well, we can't decide that as a board. That's been decided for us. So there's those kind of situations. And then what about committees and task forces? Task forces I define as specialized groups that are assigned to work on a topic for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, and then they go out of business. Committees tend to be those permanent subunits of a board. Committees, if you want them to, can be board members and non-board members. So a finance committee looks around and said, gee, there's 5 of us here and only one of us knows anything about finance. Well, let's be sure our bylaws allow us to appoint a couple CPAs or financial managers to be on the committee. Because the committee is not the board, they're only informing the board. So we can think about those as well as we clarify roles. Who can attend meetings? State organizations have sunshine rules. The media are there, everyone's there that wants to be there. Most of the non-governmental boards, it's not that open. So a university might have 50 students who want to attend a board meeting. Well, the room isn't big enough, and the chairman makes a tough decision. No, we're not going to allow students in this meeting. Well, that's going to tick off the students, and there's a price to pay. But you've got to be clear in advance of who can attend the meetings. Is it invitational or not? So you put all of these in written policies or procedures. We'll talk about how to do that in a minute, but that's the principle. Clarify roles all down the line. Rate that one on a scale of 1 to 5. Here's the third principle. The chair and the CEO must be partners to win. There's no organization I bumped into in 27 years of doing this kind of thing where the chair and the CEO are at odds. It can't work. They're not best friends. They shouldn't try to be best friends, but they're very close professionally. Each helps the other succeed. If that's the mindset, I'm CEO, I get frustrated with our board. It takes a lot of work to prepare for board meetings. But you know what? I'm going to help our chair be the best chair she can ever be. If that's the mindset, then what's the natural response? The chair says, gee, that feels pretty good. I'm going to do whatever I can with this board to make our CEO the most successful CEO around. And when you get that little dance going, things work. So regular communications. Let's have a regularly scheduled weekly, I think, is appropriate, call or visit if you're in close proximity. And let's have a simple agenda. Let's work it out so that you get to tell me the things that I need to know and I get to tell you. Let's make it regular, not on a crisis basis. So no surprises is a good rule. We just have an understanding that we're not going to get in a board meeting or any time and you're going to be surprised by what you hear through someone else. That's not going to happen. And then a CEO seldom knows really what board members are thinking about. And board members really don't know the dynamics going on at the staff level. So these two leaders, the head of the staff and the leader of the board, they can interpret those two communities to one another. Mr. Chair, here's what's really going on with the staff right now. A lot of tension. You should know about it. Here are the reasons. And the chair says to the CEO, tell you what, the grapevine is really working. The board is really frustrated and upset. You need to know about this. And together, let's work on the solution. Agendas, reports should be done together. It's very frustrating for board members to come in 3, 4, 5 times a year and look at agendas, and it looks like the agenda is all about administrative stuff, not governance stuff. Well, who put the agenda together? Well, the CFO put together the finance committee. The program vice president put together the program committee agenda, and guess what? They look like sort of management topics. And the board says, we want governance topics. Don't pull us into your stuff. Tee it up for us to discuss what's legitimate for the board to discuss. So they do it together. And they ensure that the regular meetings have good notes. Communications are going to all the people that should hear about the board meeting. You can imagine at the University of Virginia a few weeks ago when the board is off wherever they meet. You've got a few thousand people aware that they're up there in the board meeting. They're all kind of mysterious already, but now they fired our president. What in the world are they doing? Well, as soon as that board meeting is over, somebody has to have the responsibility to say, here's what happened. And it's got to be a clear message, not 16 messages. So the chair and the CEO are absolutely critical. The fourth principle is to maintain all the ongoing policies, those that don't tend to change all the time, in one document. Minutes don't do the job. If you work with a nonprofit organization that's 85 years old, all of the decisions of the board are still there. But who goes back and reads the minutes from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s? Nobody. But they are board decisions. So it'd be better if we could get all of the ongoing policies in one document. It's very possible to put everything a board needs to address in 15 to 20 pages in an organized manner. That allows new players to come on board, read this policies document, and say, I got it. I can start participating right away. The oral tradition doesn't work. It used to work, I understand, a few thousand years ago, but now we're so dependent on looking at our iPads or our iPhones to get something that was told to us 3 days ago. We just know. We don't have to remember. We've got it. We waste time reinventing the wheel. Sometimes a governing board will spend an hour and a half on a topic when 3 years ago they spent an hour and a half on the topic and they actually resolved it, but people forgot. So if it's in a document, someone could say, well, excuse me, Madam Chair, 3.6 in our policies already has a statement from the board. Are we not agreeable to that today? Oh, well, let's all look at 3.6. Well, by golly, that looks pretty good. Okay, let's move on. Let's not waste time. Sometimes a board will actually get on a topic, set a policy, and maybe the CFO or someone says 3 days later, you know what? That contradicts the policy the board said 4 years ago. Uh-oh. Which policy trumps the other? So I call it a board policies manual. I actually wrote a whole book on how to do a board policies manual. But essentially envision 15 to 20 pages, organized sort of a table of contents so that anything about finances is always in Chapter 5. Anything about the board's relation to staff is always in Chapter 2. And so you can go right there when you want to change those policies. Keeps everyone aligned, and I think when we're clear on these things, it increases trust. Stephen Covey's going to speak to you on Wednesday. I wish I were to be here. Speed of Trust is one of my favorite books. Number 5, keep visible the mission, values, strategies, and goals. In the Board Policies Manual, I call this Organization Essentials, and this is a board role. Now, this is important to understand. When the board speaks, sometimes it comes right out of the board. The board actually formulates most of its own policies with a little help from staff. You can have a good board that does that. Way over here, on the other end of the continuum, are board policies, 90% of which have been drafted by staff. That works. It works when staff are drafting, formulating policies, but the board always decides. And it works when you have a board who thinks clearly and they want to do it. It works either way. The board and the staff are partners in formulating policy. And that helps create unity and trust in the culture. All the staff need to know what our mission is, what our top 3 priorities are, what 5 values. You've all been to hospitals or doctors' offices where on the wall says our mission statement. Or in a cafeteria you have a placemat, the 5 values that guide us. Sometimes on every staff member's desk is a little placard with the current goals or the mission statement. These are so essential that everyone gets clearly. So they have to be shared widely. You use those things when you assess how are we doing so far. Well, are we accomplishing our mission? Well, let's measure it. Well, I'm not sure it's the right mission statement. Okay, let's review the mission statement. But if we say it, let's do it. Those are the 5 values that guide us. That allows a board member or a CEO or staff member to say, you know, that decision doesn't seem to be in keeping with our values. It's a nice way of saying, let's not go there. We've already decided that's not the way we do things. Absent that, any idea could have credibility. It influences evaluations of key personnel and annual performance reviews. You can say, how do you contribute to accomplishing our mission? In what you're doing, give me some examples of how the 5 values the board has agreed to are being played out in your daily work, etc. And it guides the budgets. If the board agreed those are the 3 priorities, we like big ideas, we like new ideas, but right now, these are our priorities and this is where the budget is going to be invested. And it provides the reference for all of the strategic plans all the way down the organization. So, okay, you've rated 5 principles. I've spent more time on them than I will on some of the others just to build this context. Turn now to your partner or partners and in 2 minutes or less, just share which principles you think would be useful guidance back home. Okay. As you see on the sheet, Dr. Dale Lefevre and I are going to explore these things with you in 2 workshops. Many of you know Dale. He's been working with the courts for a long time, since high school days, I think. You should know that on my display of these principles, I have a clock. And I'm the only thing standing between you and the break. And one thing you can do is always start on time and end on time. So we're going to go a little faster. I'm an extrovert. I get carried away. Principle 6, a checklist for any organization dealing with governance, is to pick a CEO that fits the times. The average life of a CEO varies by sector. 1,600 private colleges in the USA, the average tenure of a president is 7 years, down from 8. And one of the big issues in America is that 50% of the leaders of the nonprofit organizations plan to retire in the next 5 years, and very little strategy can be found to prepare leaders to fill those slots. Huge issue in the nonprofit sector. The organizations go through cycles. If we're a national organization that's going to go international, we better find a CEO who has international experience. If we're a publishing house that has produced books or magazines and we're now going to go digital, our next CEO better be experienced in the digital world. You get the picture. So you select CEOs not based on where you've been or where you are, but where you want to go. And a leader for one area may not work in another. But the important thing is a new CEO is going to do things differently. And the board has to acknowledge and give enough leeway for that CEO's strengths to be reflected in the way the staff organizations are put together, the way budgeting might be done, the way reporting might be done. They have to be ready for a new style of leadership. And then you evaluate that CEO based on the organization's needs and goals. And you start a succession plan years in advance. Too many boards are happy with their CEO. The CEO may be 52 years old, and the board is assuming this person is going to be around for another 10 or 12 years. All of a sudden, they get a notice that the CEO is taking another job. Oh my gosh, we never thought that could happen. What do we do now? So you can think in advance about what would we do if our CEO got seriously ill, died unexpectedly, took a new job, or our CEO is 64. When will that take place? What transition do we need? A board should have that all thought out with the CEO. Principle 7 is to carefully select, train, and evaluate. This goes down through the whole organization. As Jim Collins says, if you get the right people on the bus and in the right seats, you're halfway home. That's the key. And some nonprofits, because their pay structure tends to be low, are willing to accept people to bring on the bus and put in a seat that aren't very good, frankly. But they're available and they're willing to work for that salary. That's a mistake. You've got to have the right people that fit. It's easier to fire before you hire someone. We all know that. Training. In the tech world, I've been with some of the CEOs of the larger tech companies in previous jobs. They would give 8 to 10% of their budget went into training. In the nonprofit world, less than 1%. I was impressed when Pam mentioned that some have come here, or maybe you mentioned, some have come here at their own expense. That is terrific. Not many can do that. If you're being paid $38,000 and you've got a meeting in Florida, you just aren't going to go from Phoenix. So training is so important. We get what we train for, basically. And then we have to evaluate. We have to evaluate everyone. Now, in the Congress, members of Congress never evaluated themselves. But in the nonprofit world, it's beginning to be quite common where before you're re-elected to another 3-year term, all of your peers evaluate you on your attendance, your preparation, your contribution to group process, blah, 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 5, 6, 7 things on a report card. Why would board members expect staff to be evaluated annually and not expect themselves to be evaluated? So peer reviews are becoming more common. The 8th principle is to make board meetings meaningful. Many board meetings are boring. They're full of reports, oral reports. Thanks to technology, we can now send the reports out in advance, put them on a board portal so they can be read whenever a person has time to read them. And the meeting should be focused on governance. Too often they're 35 to 95% on management problems. Hey, if you want to tell us about management problems, organize a conference call, send us an email or whatever. That's your problem, CEO. We want to know about it, but when we meet, when we're together, the only reason we're together is to have dialogue about governance level things, purpose, direction, strategy, major goals. Remember the board policies manual? The output of a meeting is a wiser set of policies. So this policy manual is designed to be a living document. It's expected that it changes every board meeting. If we can't improve on the one voice of the board in writing, so why are we meeting? That's the outcome of a good board meeting. So we do the reporting and the informing in advance of board meetings. We expect board members to come prepared. Many board members get lazy. They say, oh, you sent me this 1.5-inch thick manual to read, this notebook? No way. I'll look at it on the plane as I'm going, but no way. Well, you've got to expect it. And the chair has to manage the process. You don't let someone dominate discussion all the time. And it takes a gifted chair to do that well. We don't want to waste people's time. We want them to come to meetings expecting them to be good. I'm glad I went. That was a great meeting. Number 9, seek wise counsel. Boards sometimes think that all the smarts they need are around the table. That's not the case. So board members should be willing to have non-board members on committees. I mentioned that. Same for ad hoc task forces. You need some expertise about a building, a structure, whatever. Hey, bring a developer, an environmental engineer, and others together and buy their lunch for 3 hours, and they can give you a lot more than 5 meetings of uninformed people. Boards should feel free on their own to retain legal, financial, and program advisors. Assign members to monitor trends and issues. Sometimes a board will say, if you two will monitor technology, here's 3 websites, here's 2 newsletters. You be sort of our lay technology people. You 2 board members, you keep on top of the finances in our sector. Who's doing what? Where's the money coming from? So you 3 over here look at program and so forth. Send key members to professional meetings. We've got to train board members as well as staff. We're moving fast because I see the time now in two places. Create a culture of evidence. Too many boards don't decide in advance what information they want. So they get all this information coming. It's like a fire hose in their mouths, and they don't know how to digest it, interpret it. So we want to tap the amazing information already available on the web that staff can put there. We want critical issues in a dashboard. Do you know that term? On our car, we don't need to look under the hood hardly ever anymore. If we got problems, it shows up on the dashboard. Well, you can have dashboard reports. I've seen great ones that are 1-pagers or 15-pagers. But they always tell the board what the board decided in ahead of time what they wanted. And that helps them learn to ask data-related questions. You obviously ask staff to do that on behalf of the board. I'm sorry, we're going to quit your small groups. That was fun, wasn't it? Now we're going to move on to number 11. Planning is a partnership. Few boards have time or talent to do strategic planning, and yet some of them try to, and they get off in directions that don't make sense to staff or to them eventually. But the board members do need some ownership, so how do we do this? Well, I think CEOs need to occasionally think as a board member, if I were on the board and not running things, what questions would I ask? What information would I want? You have to put yourselves, CEOs, in the shoes of a board member. And you start with the high level of decision making. What is our mission? What is our purpose? What are the values? Which strategies? For example, my board gave me, in one of my jobs, a strategy of strategic alliances, partnerships. I said, okay, let's talk about that. Every annual review, the question was, so Bob, how many strategic alliances and partnerships have you formed? Because they realized we could not fulfill the mission ourselves. Once the board has done that, then I would say let the CEO guide the process of strategic planning. Bring outsiders in to help think outside the box. Many of you probably have consulted with courts in other states because of your expertise. Number 12, be transparent and accountable. Sort of inwards today. The public expects it. The public deserves it. Most nonprofits like to keep things more private. Some things they'd rather not be known. But it does build trust and confidence. Nonprofits have to file the IRS Form 990. And we can all have access on the web to those 990s. It gives us a lot of information, but it's better if the organization initiates transparency. We're accountable to you, and here's how we're doing. Here's how we're doing in context. Here's how we're doing over time. Charts. Easy to understand. Builds trust and confidence. And you can set the annual schedules of those reports well in advance, so everybody who's responsible for preparing them knows that on April 1 we give this kind of a report. On July 1 we give out this kind of a report. Seek some of the seal of approval options. Most nonprofits can be approved by sort of an accrediting body or a certification body or a seal of approval group because you meet their standards. We all know from bad experience that when we make a big mistake, we don't get defensive. We're the first to go out and say, hey, we goofed. We learned from it, we're sorry, and we're moving on. We don't want CNN to cover the story 4 days before we then say something. We've already lost the game. So we don't want to be put on the defensive. The third principle, because I learned it from my board years and years ago, is that we can't do this stuff alone. We need partnerships. We need alliances. NACM would be one of those. And collaboration is in today. Some people have more money, more talent, more access, more networks, whatever they have. We need them and they need us. Associations and consortia are needed. A small university I worked with belonged to 33 national organizations, paying dues to 33 national organizations. Some boards decide and others are staff-level decisions. Number 14, boards must own their own improvement. Boards don't like being led by staff. But honestly, CEOs can lead the board, but you just don't want to be caught at it. Now, the board chair is the key. The board development committees are in. In other words, 3 board members say, we're just going to meet. All we're going to discuss is, do we have the right structure? Do we have the right process? Are we happy with the way things are going? Are our meetings being evaluated and improved? Do we know how to get new board members? And can we model improvement for all staff? And finally, 15, life is tough. Take time to affirm good people, good projects, good board work. Make the organization one people love to serve, not just come because they're getting paid. And I found that when you honor one person in an organization that's credible, everyone knows they deserve it, everyone feels honored. Celebrate milestones. You set a goal, you hit the target, celebrate. Sometimes it's good to party hardy. All times it's good to end on time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Andringa, for sharing those ideas. I know as we were sitting up here talking about it during some of it, we could certainly see a lot of analogies with the NACM Board of Directors, but we're also thinking about the many connections that you raised for all of us with our chief judges and court administrator connections, with judicial councils that we might work with, and with many other groups that are working. So thank you for sharing these 15 ideas of principles of good governance. And let's give Dr. Andringa another round of applause. And as the good doctor said, we are right on time. So we have on your schedule a break until 10:15. And then we'll be reconvening in a number of concurrent workshops. All of those are outlined in your program materials, and we will have many of our Florida volunteers and others that will be more than happy to guide you to the rooms if you need any assistance with that. And with that, enjoy your break. Thank you.